everybody here pretty much knows me, but I am Solimar Otero. I am a professor of folklore in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, and I'm also the co-chair of the Colloquium Committee, along with Fernando Orejuela. And I just want to welcome you here today for this colloquium. But before I introduce Eduardo Herrera, who is going to be introducing our guest, Dr. Rick Deja, I wanted to remind everybody that our next colloquium event will be on October 27th, and Dorian Jurek will be talking about bringing back Bakonja, epic geography, and the editor's imperative, and that will probably be happening in the afternoon. We're still figuring out an exact date and time, but please stay tuned. And without further ado, I want to pass it over to Eduardo.
Thank you, and thank you everybody. Thank you everybody for being here. We know it was kind of like a late colloquium announcement. It's Lotus Festival, so it's complicated for some folks to be here, but we're very glad that you made it. I'm going to read a little bit about Dr. Deja, but also will tell you a little bit about my experience with him because we overlapped at the University of Illinois. Dr. Rick Deja is a senior lecturer in ethnomusicology and African music and curator of the Kirby Collection Musical Instruments at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Rick's creative and scholarly output is rooted in performance-based research and his long-standing work with Malawian musicians in Malawi, South Africa, and the American Midwest since the 1990s. As an ethnomusicologist with a background in music performance, audio production, and composition, his research interests include jazz and popular music in Malawi and Southern Africa, comparative philosophies of improvisation, music and social belonging, and organology and music revitalization. He directs the Pan-African Jazz and Popular Music Ensemble at UCT at Cape Town, and is currently writing about the Afro-jazz movement in Malawi, as well as a pan-idiomatic improvisation and co-creation in Cape Town. Professor Deja has a PhD in musicology from the University of Illinois, a master's in jazz studies from DePaul University, and this is his alma mater. He got his BA in music here at Indiana University, so it's a return of the prodigal son. And as I promised, it's such a pleasure to have Rick here because we overlapped when he was starting to do his doctoral work. He came from having a long time of a performance career and researching career with musics of Africa, particularly in Malawi, but also came with some really cool accolades that at the moment made a lot of sense, like, oh yeah, I used to play with the 10,000 Maniacs. And I'm like, what? And it was like, yeah, well, the story's more nuanced than that, but it was pretty amazing. And at some point, we convinced Rick, so my history with playing instruments in bands has always been that I'm the worst of the players in the band, but I'm the one that doesn't mind to do the organizing. So everybody's like, yeah, okay, Eduardo doesn't play because he does the organizing. So for a while, maybe 2 years, we played together in 2 different bands.
So then I was the worst player.
No, Rick was the star for sure. We played in a Brazilian music band, and that was it.
Yeah, it seems like there's something else.
Yeah, we did something else, but I can't remember what it was. But we played, and we had like monthly gigs, and it was one of the best times in my life. So I really have very fond musical memories with Rick. So we're very happy to have you here. And today's presentation, Sounding Southern African Mobilities, Musical Cosmopolitanism and Afro-positivism in and around Malawi, I think is a beautiful kind of warm-up for today's events at Lotus, when one of the bands that Professor Deja is going to be mentioning is presented. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks so much for sharing this time and space with me and each other. I already messed up the technology here. It's on camera, so I don't know what to do. This is not the paper.
It's on camera?
Yeah. So I do have more words than is needed, so I'll try to read efficiently without being robotic, and I might make on-the-fly cuts, because I would like to have at least some time at the end to be more conversational. I have plenty of listening examples. I really like to explain and talk about them, but I'll probably just let the music speak for itself a moment, and then we can circle back to those as needed. And then on the title here, it's stereotypically academic, and I just want to remind us that hopefully the important thing about this is the individuals that I'll be talking about and the music that they use to be themselves in the world. right? And this is just a tool, these concepts and what have you, is a tool hopefully to better appreciate their music and their lives and our music and our lives accordingly. So here we go. In this paper, I explore musical cosmopolitanism in and around Malawi in an effort to examine the complexities of navigating transnational multicultural spaces from within Southern Africa. I'm intrigued by recent trends in Malawian jazz and acoustic musics where notions of hybridity and syncretism don't fully capture really what's happening. The creative choices and the lived realities of these musical artists in this region goes beyond that. And as such, my discussion will center on two case studies, Malawian jazz guitarist Erik Paliani and the duo Madalitso Band, comprised of a 4-string guitar and babatone 1-string bass. Both are internationally acclaimed artists based in Malawi, and the latter of whom are currently on tour and will be performing at the Lotus World Music Festival. And so I'm building upon the notion of Afro-positivism as a methodological tool which imposes neither an optimistic nor a pessimistic evaluation of contemporary realities in Southern Africa, but rather emphasizes empirical observations of actual individuals and groups in tangible contexts. Individuals living in Southern Africa, however, are surrounded by multifarious expressions of Africanness and typically encounter varying degrees of biases linked to subjective views about local African and international Euro-North American musics. So my engagement with this topic is also influenced in part by being an American immigrant in South Africa who is an active performer and educator of jazz and African music at the University of Cape Town. And I'm interested in fostering a more inclusive participation within African cosmopolitan contexts by examining regional musical practices and participating within those practices where possible. Social boundaries marked by race and economic class persist quite obviously in South Africa as well as Malawi. Popular discourses within the creative industries tend to utilize binary oppositions between European and African, white and black, international and cultural. Musical processes, however, are much more fluid than that, and social interchange within Southern African creative industries seems to highlight this. And so for this reason, I'm hoping to explore these musics as a way to engage with everybody who is in that part of the world via musical performance. So as such, I'm looking at this as a means to formulate both a critical lens and a political stance in appreciating, researching, and creating contemporary African jazz and acoustic music. So before I go too far into the musical examples, and I do want to really engage with those, I just want to establish a brief, hopefully brief, theoretical overview and just get a sake of clarity in how I'm using cosmopolitanism. So I'm drawing primarily from Thomas Torino's use of the term as it relates to the formation of types of translocal cultural groups, which I shall outline herein. He explains that cultural groups in general are bound by shared habits of thought and practice which arise out of processes of socialization and are affected by the surrounding material conditions and environments. He speaks in terms of constellations of shared attributes, namely conceptions, ethics, aesthetics, practices, technologies, objects and social style, habits and resources for living. Cosmopolitan formations can exist across multiple sites in geographically disconnected locales of different scales and having different spheres of influence. As such, members of cosmopolitan groups are shaped and bound by communication loops, rather than primarily heritage or homeland as within immigrant and diasporic communities. It's often the case that cosmopolitan discourses stress individuality, placelessness, universalism, and pan-historicism, which in turn shapes outlooks of individuals within these cultural groups. But it does so in relation to local contexts via interpersonal relationships, and this aspect is crucial for my discussion. Anthony Perman, in his study of musicians specializing in sungura, a musical genre popularized in Zimbabwe, points to both uses and shortcomings of cosmopolitanism. He explains that even variations, like regional ones, don't fit exactly, but one notable point is the significance of music making as a mode of engaging with the world around these musicians living and working in Southern Africa. He explains that these musicians use sungura music in very different ways to help shape, express, and assert their own complex identities in a multifaceted Zimbabwe in ways that tie them to the Africa around them. Traditional identity markers and cohesive forces do not necessarily apply, right? He says these musicians play sungura and participate, a participation based not on indigeneity, ethnicity, nationality, Africanicity, globalicity, but in community, and an effort to belong in the complex, multifaceted society in which they live, and from which sungura emerged. Notably, there's the centrality of musical creation and participation. There's also an instability of identity categorization. One might describe it as messy and even contradictory, akin to Stephen Feld's assessment of his experience of cosmopolitanism and jazz in Accra, Ghana. Feld outlines numerous variations and contextual idiosyncrasies of cosmopolitanism, highlighting contradictions, ironies, and unevenness that one might term vernacular cosmopolitanism, described by Homi Bhabha. Feld emphasizes aspects like solidarity and difference, uprootedness, defamiliarization, and he does so in relation to jazz cosmopolitanism, which he outlines thusly. Jazz cosmopolitanism in Accra is about histories of listening, echoing, sounding, about acoustomology, the agency of knowing the world through sound. Taken together, I'm using musical cosmopolitanism to look at the role of musical sound and practice, interpersonal relationships, and finding connections amongst disjuncture. So it's with this in mind that I turned to the music of Madalitso Band and Erik Paliani as an entry point to musical cosmopolitanism in Southern Africa and the intricacies of local, translocal interplay. So I'm going to play an excerpt from an official music video of Madalitso Band. It takes place in Lilongwe. Everything about it is fairly reasonable. We can talk about it at the end, but I think it's a good capture of their life, their music, and their sound. So I've paused it there, really following the musical cues. The tension created in the pedal point of the bass is a beautiful canonic device that they use, and it's typical in a lot of banjo music. And I'm really wanting us to kind of hear the musical sounds and how they intermingle and create this other cohesive output. That's how they travel, that's their motorcycle, that's how they suit up and do it, and yeah, so I'll leave that. This is, you've seen their vibe and their sound. This is my musical description of what I'm hearing. The music of Madalitso Band is a living tradition rooted in centuries-old Southern African musical instruments and practices. This banjo tradition comes from the ramki lute developed by the Khoi people of Southern Africa during the 18th century. The babatone one-string bass instrument is descended from the centuries-old one-string brown bow, also called earth bow, also indigenous to Southern Africa. Madalitso's playing style stems from the Kwela and itinerant guitar traditions that emerged from musical transformations in the early 1900s during the World Wars. Diasporic popular music such as spirituals, blues, and jazz, and later Cuban soul and Jamaican reggae were reintroduced on the African continent via records, radio, and returning soldiers coming back from abroad. Local musicians transformed these foreign influences into new, unique local traditions which have continued for generations. Now in this description, I situate the band and their music within the long-established traditions highlighting indigenous African roots, as well as diasporic interchange. Africanist scholarship in the mid-20th century tended to frame this similarly by calling it neo-traditional music, highlighting the novel developments and adaptations on the one hand, while acknowledging it as a traditional music in dialogue with established African traditions. And just to, if you're not sure what a ramki or an earth bow is, you can see this is mostly self-explanatory, but these go back hundreds of years, right? And I wrote this explanation to help them secure a visa because they, powers that be, are looking for different types of things. So I framed it in a way that talks about indigeneity and not just a hybrid, their take on Western musics. Now, as the group continues to raise its international profile, record reviews within the creative industry supply additional perspectives which are also worth noting. Several reviews tend to highlight the rustic homemade instruments and the happy upbeat rhythms and melodies, but one reviewer adds a bit more context, situating Madalitso's music within the regional market and comments on the value of music. So I'm going to read this at length as well to kind of give us another perspective that I find helpful. So, the South Africa-derived rhythms of Malawi's regional folk/pop hybrids, often produced on homemade instruments out of economic necessity, have garnered a bit of attention of late. There's been the success of babatone player Gaspar Nali, the Malawi Mouse Boys gigs at Peter Gabriel's Woman Festival, and tours of Australia, New Zealand, and the US. Moya Malamusi's recent field documentation of regional bands titled Banjo Bands of Malawi, as well as releases by Tonga Boys and Kukaya on Poland's 1000 Hertz label. So it's no surprise to find the Madalitso Band playing Denmark's Roskilde Festival, doing multi-week tours of Europe, featuring on BBC Africa, and having this, their second LP, released on Geneva's Bongo Joe label. Here I just want to point out this sort of quintessential cosmopolitan ethos, as well as how he situates the band in regional context. So he's talking about other bands that are doing similar things. He's talking about these tours, BBC, recordings. He talks about, he links the band to South African-derived rhythms, which speaks to how specific power centers influence conceptions and establish a shared reference point. Now, I don't agree with his assessment as linking to South African rhythms. There are other links to South Africa for sure. But the point is that there are these different scales of power centers and points of shared references. And South Africa is known and Malawi is not. And so this is kind of how this circulation of ideas and conceptions emerges. Miller also alludes to a network of similar artists situating Madalitso Band within a contemporary tradition, which he describes as regional folk/pop hybrid. And this suggests the difficulty in situating the musical style somewhere between local and international or translocal. I'm not going to play this, but I have a link to the Moya Malusi footage of other banjo bands that if there was questions about it, we could go to that. It's just to point out that they're not an anomaly. They're contemporary. This is a part of a longer acoustic tradition that is rooted in Malawi and that surrounding region. I do want to continue with the conclusion of this recording review, which I find interesting. He concludes this way: this is music of necessity. While it's important that they are receiving global recognition, this has nothing to do with the reasons for making music in the first place. The world should take notice of Malawi, and records like this one will help. It's clear, yet it's clear, the Madalitso Band aren't waiting around for the world to care. My sense is that he's projecting a little bit of his own views and his sense and passion of music making and how he wants the world to know music. But I still appreciate it. I have to appreciate the sentiment here. Though it may be a bit speculative, he at least avoids the problematic happy Africa trope and focuses on the musicians as individuals. I interpret them as saying they are authentic to themselves first, right? And then other things about marketing might come later. Even in a multi-influential cosmopolitan setting, it is important to consider the idea that musicians, like anyone else, are expressing the realities of who they are as a whole, and not a blend of distinct local and translocal influences. And so with that in mind, I'll just play, I don't know, a minute or so of them performing not in a music video, but it is a multi-camera shot, and so you can get a sense of the instruments and the sounds once again. went to another excerpt. But I can tell you all the different influences and what they might index and what have you, but that misses the point. It is matter of fact. It is African, it is Malawian, it is cosmopolitan, it is them. It is their music and their voices coming out through it. And together we have all access to that. And what I've done here is showing you the music first before I actually introduce the band. And I'm drawing that from Stephen Feld's work of musical cosmopolitanism, acoustomology, navigating through sound. So, who are Madalitso? The band comes from Lilongwe, the capital city of Malawi, and is comprised of lead singer Yobu Maligwa, who plays the babatone, the bass, and Yosef Kalikeni on the 4-string guitar, backing vocals, and the homemade kick drum. The band began its rise within the international music industry in 2017 when they performed at Sauti za Busara Festival in Zanzibar. Following that was another significant stepping stone achieved with their performance in 2019 at the WOMAD Festival. This provided a foundation upon which to build European tours, and now in 2023, expanding into the US for the first time. While they've grown their international profile over the years, the local Malawian audience outside of Lilongwe knew relatively little about them until recently. This is not uncommon within the music, world music circles, where the idea is to get local music, present them to an international audience, and then they kind of lose touch with their home base. That doesn't always happen, but this is kind of one of those things that happens. Another thing that is in play here is how Malawians sort of value and how regions value local music. So in many African countries where narratives of progress and modernity have featured prominently in public discourses, local acoustic musical practices are sometimes devalued. At the same time, these practices often emerge out of paltry circumstances and as such are often material minimalist but expressively rich in idiosyncratic musical and artistic references in dialogue with local audiences and contexts. This devaluation is likely related to this very provincialism and viewed as not having sufficient currency on the global market. That perception tends to shift upon receiving international accolades, thus increasing social and cultural capital. However, in the case of Madalitso, they'd done 2 world tours and Malawi still didn't really know who they were. In response to this recent year, they did do a tour throughout the country of just doing sort of house parties and local acoustic venues to get that connection. And at the center of this are, so this process of negotiating multiple local and international audiences is perhaps at the heart of musical cosmopolitanism. At the center of this are the artists themselves who synthesize the sum of their translocal intersections, forging their own artistic sound based on their life's experiences. Madalitso music fits the cosmopolitan world music formula with accessible elements that index particular local idiosyncrasies. More accurately, the music articulates with numerous international, regional, and local traditions within Africa and beyond, demonstrating African aesthetic and social principles within a cosmopolitan package. Individual musicians and audiences members will all make sense of this, using sounds based on their associations and their own sonic horizons. With Madalitso, the dance music aesthetic tends to unite people, and for this reason creates this shared social space. Now, it's with this in mind that I turn to Malawian jazz guitarist Erik Paliani, whose music has different aesthetic priorities, but once again is a fluid amalgam of local, international, and diasporic influences, which for him are all fundamentally African. So Erik Paliani's 2010 solo album, Chituku Tuku, recorded in South Africa with local musicians, is largely autobiographical, using music influenced by mid-20th century Central and Southern African styles, along with other international styles, and it kind of depicts a sonic narrative of growing up in Malawi. The title track is a remake of 1950s Malawian composition called Chituku Tuku, and the other track that I'll have us listen to is an original composition of Erik's called Toto Ife. So I'm going to show 2 videos side by side. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but this is the way it's set up. And what you're going to see, I'm not changing it now, are 2 recent videos from 2022 and 2019 of Erik performing in Israel, in Tel Aviv, as a trio first, and then in a duo setting. And so the aspects of interest, to my mind, is the coalescing of stylistic elements as he draws seamlessly from a variety of expressive devices, and does so, in this case, with musicians not from Malawi. so there's lots going on there. I'll highlight some of what's in there so that you can have that in watching the next clip. And the things that I want to highlight are the rhythmic interactions via melody and the interaction of the musicians. I mean, there you could see them really putting their bodies in a way to interact and highlighting this sort of acoustomology type of notion that many musicians take for granted. Similar type of thing here. This will be a briefer clip. So I think that's enough just to get us a little bit of contrast and some sort of mental sonic imagery. So the first clip is Tutubutuhu. Paliani's transformation of that illustrates some common Afro-jazz creative strategies and harmonic schemes and interpretive liberties. However, his transformation of the tune goes beyond chord substitutions and involves reinterpreting various indigenous and international musical aesthetics, such as duple and triple metric juxtapositions, timbral variations, and fingerstyle techniques. Second clip, called Todo Buffet. On the surface, the original composition emphasizes a indigenous Malawian musical sort of underlying sensibility. The melody and rhythm have strong indexes to indigenous traditions, which allude to pentatonic melodic shapes and phrases in 12/8 time, but rendered in an idiosyncratic way that links it to Malawi. I realize that there's lots of things that are in 12/8 and pentatonics, but you'll just have to take my word for it. So I asked Erik about this, and I wanted to know if there was a particular indigenous rhythm dance genre underneath this sort of tutu totally fade tune. And he replied this way: "This can be very interesting. It's perhaps the true definition of a 6/4 groove. On the recording and performance, the drummer lays a groove with the snare emphasized as a 4/4, while Claule, the percussionist, and myself think more in a 6/8 point of view." And this one was puzzling to me, and I was like, dude. Because listening to other performance of this tune, he has inserted vocal yelps typical of those of Gule Wampulu, which is a masked dance tradition of the Niao Secret Society in Malawi. And it makes sense that Paliani explains the meaning behind the tune as basically Dies of Chembe village, which is in this region where Gule Wampulu is being performed. He's saying that they're trying to get tourists to leave him alone. He could have just said, this is like Gule Wampulu, and I would have understood reasonably well. But his response illustrates not only a juxtaposition of perspectives within the band, where he's saying the drummer's doing 4/4 and we're doing 6/8, but he's talking with me, code switching into more music theory speak rather than sort of cultural background. And this is consistent with how I've observed him teach in other contexts, where at any given time, multiple perspectives involving the sonic and the social coalesce, not by formula, but by the pragmatics of personal expression, which strikes me as emblematic of jazz and musical cosmopolitanism. I'll continue with a little bit background on Paliani now. We saw his music, and now let's hear about him. Erik Paliani is one of the contemporary leaders of the jazz scene in Malawi, fronting bands drawing heavily from international jazz aesthetics and performance practice. He's an established performer and industry professional who's made substantial efforts to promote jazz education as well. He's a local legend in Malawi, due in part to his success while based in South Africa, beginning just prior to 2000. He worked regularly with jazz trumpeter Hima Sekela, singer Zamajobe, as well as abroad with guitarist Lee Rittenauer. Since his return to Malawi in 2018, he's been instrumental in cultivating a niche jazz scene with what I would describe as ideologically and musically progressive straight-ahead jazz by training musicians and curating live shows. His life and career exhibits notable aspects of mobility and interchange. He was born in the southern region, went to secondary school in the central region, and then further education in the northern region, 3 culturally distinct regions in Malawi, did studies in Zimbabwe, and then he moved to South Africa for 20 years. And while this aspect of Paliani's background alone does not constitute cosmopolitanism, this sort of mobility as a lived experience is notable. As a young adult in the mid-1990s, he moved back to Blantyre where he went on to perform with the Acacia's band. And this is a significant band for him because he keeps bringing them up in numerous interviews. In this one for Urban Life TV, he says, "The reason I always mention that band is that under the situation, we kind of aspired to create a band that was more professional in terms of how it was run, but also in terms of the repertoire that we could perform, and also just general respect of musicianship and learning more new things." And this illustrates a sense of mobility of ideas, versatility, and perhaps a general acquisition of cultural capital. His career further demonstrates versatility across numerous roles that include composer, arranger, musical director, producer, educator, and multi-instrumentalist. Subsequently, his career has included regular touring Europe, Southern Africa, and now recently in Israel. Transcending provincialism, while also being influenced by local contexts, is perhaps a hallmark of cosmopolitanism. Similarly, it might be said that jazz allows for transcending boundaries while articulating with a shared canon of expressive devices. And here I have an excerpt. I'm going to try to go through this. I want to talk about the Lilongwe Jazz Festival, which is basically Erik and some colleagues manifesting this really strong belief in what jazz has to offer in this festival format. So here we go. Erik sought to accomplish this interplay in Malawi by establishing Summer Jazz Festival, and he described some goals. Quote, "To achieve the proper standard of jazz music and bring, quote, a series of great jazz musicians from Southern Africa, but also hopefully to incorporate their performances with Malawian musicians so they can share notes, but also share knowledge." Ultimately, the Jazz Festival posted these goals on their website, and I'll just read them quickly. "The festival shall support upcoming and established local music programs targeted at the enhancement and appreciation of jazz as a music genre. To provide an annual event that provides the community with a platform to celebrate the richness and diversity through jazz. To provide a platform for the interface of Malawian and other cultures through jazz. And to play a role in building a long-term musical and artistic infrastructure in Malawi." Taken together, the values... I am from the 20th century. I just want the keyboard to go. Okay, everything's under control. Taken together, translocal interchange of knowledge and values via education, performance, and development, entertainment, and structure. And notably, jazz plays a central role. It is positioned as an internationally recognized artistic currency, which in Malawi is framed as needing to be enhanced and appreciated. Furthermore, local cultural diversity and richness is presented as needing to be celebrated and to interface with other cultural groups and practices. I interpret this as another example of jazz or musical cosmopolitanism in Malawi, in Africa. And so from that, I'm pivoting from jazz, the translocal genre, to Afro-jazz and asserting Africanness, because that's also important in these contexts for Erik and his colleagues. In celebration of Africa Day on 25 May 2021, Kaesa Creative Center, where he is based, Erik created a video series titled, "What is Africa to You?" Below is Paliani's response at length, which illustrates deep affinity to Africa, far and beyond being a place. And this is on the fly. He's not really thinking this out, but it's very telling in a lot of aspects, and we could unpack it for days, but we're just going to listen to it and circle back if we need to. Here we go.
Erik, what is Africa to you?
You know, Africa is everything, man, you know. Africa is one country, first of all. Musically, and Africa is the best place to be. Africa has to be where it needs to be. I think for me, I'm so excited to be African, and I'm so excited to learn anywhere in the world as an African. And what I've noticed out there in the world is that when you come out there and produce your African base, and you're proud and confident about yourself as an African, the whole world respects you as an further, I want to catch the youngsters to probably be African first of all, but also be unique Africans and take this Africanism to the next level. Thank you very much.
Okay. So he's echoed similar sentiments in other interviews. For instance, when asked about Richard Bona, he exclaims, "I like him because he's an African who's not scared to show off Africa and himself to the world. And I think that's an approach we need to have." And these are just a couple examples highlighting the centrality of Africa in relation to his music making. And it does speak to the situation in Malawi, which I could expand on later if needed. And so, it's against this backdrop that I assess my own positioning as a foreign white male and frequent participant in the Malawian music industry since 1991, including with the Acacius Band where I met Erik Paliani first, and the Lilongwe Jazz Festival that I discussed briefly. Currently based in South Africa, I try to be aware of complexities of cultural representation in cosmopolitan African spaces and in understanding power relations in this region. Sheila Croucher reminds us of the privilege of movement rooted in nationality and relative affluency, along with the importance of investigating the underlying friction and inequality. Sarah Koons problematizes the so-called distinction between migrant and expat within many discourses. There is no distinction, it's coded, it's white in color, basically. So I'm prone to believe that musical participation offers notable opportunity for co-constructed spaces by different subjectivities. Perhaps musical cosmopolitanism illustrates an informative framework of sound relations and social relations. My sense, however, is that one needs to be aware of frictions and inequalities so that the formation of cosmopolitan spaces and values is indeed a co-constructed dialogical process, where all voices are heard within the realm of arts creation and circulation and beyond. Music is significant as an art form and social practice involving play, where real-life conventions can be made momentarily suspended and malleable. Music making as a site for nurturing human empathy is crucial. Gamelan scholar and practitioner Putu Hiramayana advances this notion in his discussion of musical hybridity involving the combination of Balinese gamelan and heavy metal. Musical hybridity as a safe haven of juxtaposing ideology does not presume the oversight of problems likely to surface, but rather forms a praxis of play that includes a developing exigency for knowledge. It is a way to efficiently delve into cultures that are at the margins. Inspired by this, with the works of Achille Mbembe, Sarah Balakrishnan, and also Ryan Skinner, I conclude this talk with a look at qualified cosmopolitanisms in conjunction with Afro-positivism. Skinner employs Gregory Mann's use of Afro-positivism as meaning, quote, a real, empirical, and ethical commitment to perceiving African societies as lived by Africans now. Skinner does this to suggest Afro-positivism as, quote, the methodological corollary to Afropolitanism's Africanist provenance and orientation. What is Afropolitanism? Well, for Achille Mbembe, it is a name for undertaking a critical reflection on the many ways in which, in fact, there is no world without Africa, and there is no Africa that is not a part of it. He continues explaining that if, in fact, we define Afropolitanism the way I have done in terms of movement, mobility, circulation, and if we study popular forms of everyday life, these popular forms of everyday life are the richest archives of Afropolitan practices. I like Gregory Mann's empirical approach that stresses neither optimism nor pessimism, just matter of fact, just the fact. Mbembe's observation about the geographies of mobility and circulation and the omnipresence of African contributions is also admirable. Add to this musical cosmopolitanisms within and beyond Africa, and I believe there can be a ripe context for multilateral interchanges and shared vulnerability. And maybe we can better navigate multifaceted spaces in Southern Africa and beyond, and build a humanistic framework derived from appreciating, researching, and creating music broadly glossed as Afro-jazz and acoustic music. And that is all I have for today.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thanks for that talk. We have about 15 minutes if folks have questions, comments, additions, and I think I'll let you feel
Yeah.
the room. I think it's easiest.
Or we could all grab beers, it's fine. So, yeah.
So I'm not an ethnomusicologist, I'm an anthropologist. So I really want to think about this term, Afro-positivism, a little bit more. Henry Makulu and I wrote something in 2012, kind of thinking about Mbembe and Ryan Skinner's work.
Okay.
And one of the things I want to ask you about that I also noticed in the music videos is this question about, I mean, on the one hand, like I get Afro-positivism as a response to Afro-pessimism and wanting to think more expansively about creativity and creative practice, and that's one of the things we wanted to talk about. But we also want to think about, well, like, what are the structural constraints that endure? And I found most striking in the music video, right, the motorcycle runs out of gas, right?
Yeah.
And I know this is part of their persona, right, it's part of the video, but it's also part of the reality, right? That you can be a globally traveled musician and not have electricity because of load shedding, or not have gas because of political problems in the capital, for example. And I wonder how your work figures those kinds of limitations in without considering them as limitations in the way that an Afro-pessimist might, right?
Yeah,
So that was a long way around.
yeah, I'll respond to the extent that I'll answer the question may be debatable. But so I'll start with, however, that my original reading of Afro-positivism, I did frame it as in response to Afro-pessimism. But if you look at the Gregory Mann article in full, he's talking about, I want to say, some Morocco or some dispute there. And he's like, it doesn't matter what we think, you have to look at it for what it is. And it's more in the methodological approach in history folks. Yeah. So it's outside of my comfort zone theoretically. But what I wanted to retain from that is the matter-of-fact aspect of it, because in the cosmopolitanism that Stephen Feld is talking about within music, there's these all weird juxtapositions, and you are comfort in being dislocated, and all these, well, he was much more eloquent in the words, but you have these weird juxtapositions, and this is real, and this is fine, and this is something that everybody in that region can learn to embrace. And so I'm speaking of this more towards a South African audience, because there is very positive interactions and stuff, but there's also, okay, this is the European stuff, and we've got load shedding, and oh, the ANC, blah, blah, blah. And it becomes coded racially, whereas the fault is not a political party, but it's a black political party. And I'm like, you know, this cosmopolitanism in Africa is us. I mean, right, and I'm speaking, you know, and it's foreigners, and white and black foreigners, and they get treated massively differently. And so there's all these interchanges that if we embrace being in Africa instead of wanting to import Europe, we might be better off. And that doesn't mean celebrating, yay, Africa, hooray, Cultural Day, Heritage Day, and all this, colors and rainbows and stuff. It's just, we're in Africa, man, and that's fine. And that's what I take from that. That's how I'm using it, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answered the question, but anyways.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I really appreciated your comment.
Thanks.
And it's kind of building on that, an idea that I had is, because it sounds like just the name should be something more like Afrofactualism or something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And in thinking in those terms about the music that you presented today, there is a contrast in the, let's say, the cosmopolitan game that you're playing. When you're doing jazz versus when you're doing, pardon me, I don't know the genre again.
Well, they call it banjo music. That's the
All right, banjos, right? Like, you're playing a different game, and the answer about what is Africa seems to me to reflect that particular game. The game of that cosmopolitan vision that does not have as many constraints than what Madalitso is kind of facing. And just because I don't know if there's a question here, but what I'm kind of considering, and I think you know what I'm talking about when I mentioned Lisa Waxer's work on cosmopolitanism. She was writing about salsa, which I know is not your thing, but she was pointing out the differences between a lower class, in her case it was mostly maritime bound Pacific and Atlantic, cosmopolitanism that was lower class, that was generating a different kind of local interactions than the I guess more upper class or middle class cosmopolitanism that perhaps is jazz. I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I'm gonna respond with a discussion on Afro-positivism, and why I didn't use that term is because it has those two, it has multiple discursive thoughts and processes of it, and one of the critiques of it outside of the Bay realm, although including that, was that it tends to refer just to the upper class, urban elites that have been well-traveled and well-educated, Africans that listen to Fela, and then the latest thing, and then they go and then they eat fufu, and then they do this, and they're like these worldly, that colloquially urban cosmopolitanism, which I tried to situate cosmopolitanism using the disparate, just the circuits of interchange, because then that can get rid of the class issue. I don't have an answer to it, and I'm actually probably won't write with Afro-positivism in general, because I'm just not going to do that. I think it's confusing, and I don't know what to do with cosmopolitanism. I want to talk about something else. But with Erik, for instance, one thing, look, I come from a variety of privileges, so to talk about class mobility within Africa can be awkward, and I don't want to speak too much about it, but I will share, I guess, a conversation with me and Erik and Neil, the manager of Madalitso, and those guys, like types of conversations where Erik said something. He says, I need somebody to be as comfortable with an iPhone as eating encina. So he really talks about going across, like being, you embrace the good things in life, but don't reject the material lesser things, right? He wants that whole gamut, and I don't know how to express that theoretically, but I do know that as a musician, traveling almost anywhere, but in that part of the world, I mean, you segue from very wealthy and good material conditions. I mean, there's great gigs, there's great comfortable gigs and long tours that might be great, and other things that not. And you're going to go wherever you need to go through the music, and it's one aspect that begins to at least temper class distinctions amongst others. I don't know if that's totally answering it, but that's the things that I'm reminded of when you get that. Woo! Good times! I don't have a grand gesture to conclude things.
No, I think that we're very thankful for your presentation. I think it really frames nice Lotus presentation for tonight. Maybe we can